dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Новостях в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 27th of August, 2025, and here we are with the second part of our exploration of the mythology around the Prague Spring and associated issues, should we say. The first part is available on the YouTube and Rumble pages and on Kick, so you can go and find that on there. And just as some housekeeping before we start, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already, and also to subscribe to all the relevant platforms. So we are live on YouTube, X, Twitch, Rumble, and Kick. So be sure to subscribe to all of those. You never know when we're going to get booted off the main YouTube page. So we did some time the other day on the Prague Spring and some of the main mythologies around it, and using this as a sort of myth busting episode, or a couple of episodes in actual fact. But there's more to say on this. So I wanted to specifically look at, from the socialist countries at the time, and look at how accurate these were, and how these reflected things in the communist movement at the time, and the that were in place back then. So I will just make a couple of adjustments here. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in so far, and I'll talk about the various different aspects of this for a while, and then we will pause and take questions. So bear with me for just a moment. Okay. Right. Okay. So we are going to start off with a look at the concepts of social imperialism. Now, social imperialism, if you joined us for the last episode, was a concept that has been around for quite some time, but it was originally coined by Lenin in reference to the social chauvinists of the Second International in the period of World War I. And what it meant was socialist in word, imperialist in deed, which described most of the leadership of the Second International. Meaning that though they talked of socialism, their actual practice was pro-imperialist. In terms of the First World War, it was in backing their ruling class in the assault on another country. So for the British Labour Party, the bulk of them backing the British ruling class's war with the Germans. Same with the French. For the Germans, it was backing their ruling class's war with the Russians on the one hand, the Italians on the other, the French and the British on the other, all to divide and redivide the world. And these social democratic parties, Lenin said, memorably on many different occasions, had become like appendages of their ruling classes. Their leadership certainly had, and that they were essentially not just being in favor of a war of national defense. They were in supporting and actually advocating for a war of predatory conquest, and with the specific aim of hyper exploiting the peasantry and proletarians of the oppressed nations. And that is the essence of Western European and British and American social democracy. It talks about socialism, but it is not. It is a socialism that is based on the imperial conquest and hyper exploitation of the oppressed peoples of the world. Now, how does that apply when we're talking about Prague, 1968, Czechoslovakia, 1968? Well, you'll be aware if you followed this channel for a while, but I will repeat the necessary facts here, that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, of course, split in the early 1960s, though the split had been coming for some time, over the question of the correct way to revolution, the correct way to build socialism, the historic role of Joseph Stalin, the secret speech of Khrushchev from the Congress in 1956, those issues, and of course the role of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which the Soviet revisionists did away with in, I believe it was 1961, which of course drew strong objections from the Chinese and the Albanians, and rightly so. So during the split between the CPC, Communist Party of China, along with the Albanian Labour Party, which is the Party of Labour, which was the ruling party in the period of Enver Hoxha in Albania. In this split, the allegations were made by the Chinese leadership, and then following on from that, the Albanian leadership, that the Soviet Union wasn't just a revisionist force in the world, that it had become an oppressive force, and a force that was almost as invested, or in later years, the Chinese would say even more invested in oppressing the neo-colonial world than even the US or the British, which we'll go on to see how much of a mistake that was. And it started in the early 1960s. So when we come to the events of the Prague Spring, this is what the Chinese party in their official documents accused the Soviet Union of. They said it was, and I'm quoting from the title of the article I'm going to quote from: "Diabolical social imperialist face of the Soviet revisionist renegade clique." Something about the Chinese in the 1960s and early 1970s. They did have wonderfully catchy titles. So I'm just going to post that link there in the chat so you can all see the article I'm referring to. Because what this article accuses the Soviet Union of is social imperialism, the same way in which, of course, Lenin rightly applied the term to the Second International parties. Now, what the Chinese said, and the Albanians, of course, followed along with this, was that the Soviet revisionists had not only reintroduced capitalism to the Soviet Union, but they had also now become an imperialist power. They were looking to export capital around the world and to exploit the various nations around the world in a similar manner to an imperialist power. And by exporting capital out of the Soviet Union, because the argument of the Chinese communists was that the Soviet leadership was now capitalist, that they were extracting surplus value from the exploitation of the Soviet workers, which they were then looking to gain greater profit from by investing in other countries and exploiting those countries in the same way that the imperialists did. So socialist in word, imperialist in deed. It's the same basic definition is used by Lenin, but applied to the Soviet Union. It was a catastrophically bad theory for many different reasons, but we will go into now before talking about this article. Because what it did was it was a very crude, ultra-leftist analysis of the actual balance of forces inside the Soviet Union in 1961, and in fact continued to be a crude analysis about the Soviet Union right up to the end. By making this argument, what the Chinese party did was it took a split that was already bad and made it almost irreparable. Because if you're going to say that the Soviet Union is on the same level as US and British and French imperialism, well, it is factually inaccurate. First of all, the first mistake that the Chinese analysis and the Albanian analysis makes is in assuming that capitalism had been fully restored inside the Soviet Union. This was not the case. What had happened after 1953, and especially after 1956, was that, yes, the revisionist clique had tried to move in the direction of the restoration of certain capitalist methods in the management of industry, and that this was designed by the revisionists' base, shall we say, political base, which was full-time bureaucrats in the party, the state, and the industrial management mechanisms. And the things like Khrushchev's turning over of the tractor stations to the collective farms, for instance, was a very damaging thing, because it, in essence, started a process of privatization of certain state assets. But it must be said, even with the increased privileges that the bureaucracy gave itself, even with the payment by results or bonuses by results within the industrial management sector, even with that, capitalism was still not restored in the Soviet Union, because the way in which the economy was planned, and the way in which the working class still had an influence within the system, precludes a full restoration of capitalism. So the argument of the Chinese and the Albanians was that capitalism had been fully restored. And not only that, it had been fully restored and already had grown into imperialism. This wasn't true. There was a pro-capitalist clique within the Soviet leadership. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt. And it had a very strong influence in the early Khrushchev period. It got pushed back in the later Khrushchev period, and was in a battle for influence during the Brezhnev period. Now, the pro-capitalists tried to introduce various different, as I said, pro-capitalist techniques into the management of Soviet industry, including the increasing the rate of exploitation of the Soviet working class. Now, there's two things here that I would say that defy the Chinese and the Albanian analysis about the restoration of capitalism. First of all, is the fact that the great bulk of the surplus that was still produced by Soviet industry was actually still reinvested in new means of production, and a great bulk of it actually went to fund social development in the Soviet Union. That was true even with all the flaws that the Soviet economy developed in the revisionist period, all the way up to the mid-1980s. Yes, the leadership clique, the senior party officials, senior state officials, senior industrial managers did slice themselves off a greater and greater portion of the, shall we say, the surplus value produced, and did this in a corrupt fashion, feathering their own nests, building little empires for themselves. This was undoubtedly a problem, and it would be foolish to deny that. Even the Soviet leadership, all the way up to Gorbachev himself, all the way through the Brezhnev era, the Andropov era, the Chernenko era, all admitted that there was a problem with overly privileged bureaucrats. There was a problem with corruption. There was a problem with the building of a shadow economy based on the activities of corrupt officials. This was all known, and there were attempts to deal with it, abortive attempts, as it turns out, failed attempts. But what that is the dangers identified by Lenin of the bureaucracy itself, the bureaucracy claiming privileges and carving out territory for itself and awarding itself extra rations. This was all warned of by Stalin as well as a potentially damaging thing. Doesn't mean that the capitalism has been fully restored in the Soviet Union. It means that there's been damage done by a particularly pro-capitalist clique, but there was a contest going on there. So they weren't able to fully restore capitalism until, well, the very end of the 1980s. So they didn't restore capitalism. It was a contested situation where you'd had a certain degree of advance towards socialism in the Stalin era. It became a more confused and mixed picture in the revisionist era. But there was some significant economic advances, and the system was still a planned economy, even though they kept trying to introduce more and more market elements to it. But these were always stiffly opposed by a still formidable in the 60s and 70s revolutionary wing that opposed market mechanisms, that opposed the increased trade being done with the imperialist bloc, that opposed the repeated attempts at reconciliation and making concessions to the imperialists. So the Chinese analysis was wrong at the very start. Capitalism hadn't been restored in the Soviet Union. The working class continued to make significant material progress all the way up to the early 1980s, even with all the problems that came with that and the contradictions that did exist in the USSR. So if capitalism's not been fully restored, then you can't then go on to say that, because of that, the Soviet Union has become an imperialist power because it's now looking to export capital and exploit other nations. Now, this isn't to say that the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev didn't behave in a very hostile way towards the Chinese. They did. They didn't try and sabotage Chinese industrial development. They did by withdrawing cooperation. They did do these things, which was a criminal action by the Khrushchevite clique. But it doesn't constitute imperialism. It constitutes the reactionary behavior. It constitutes revisionism. It constitutes a hostile act. But what it does not constitute is imperialism in any way. This is not the same thing. What they've done, the Chinese ended up doing was sort of making a sort of a hysterical ultra-left statements, not backed up by a serious analysis, to use Mao's old phrase of seeking truth from facts. They weren't doing that. They were sloganeering by the middle of the 60s. So when we come to the Chinese analysis of the Prague Spring and the Warsaw Pact intervention in Czechoslovakia, this is the analysis that comes from Peking Review that I posted in the chat just a moment ago. It goes as follows. So I'll read this particularly, I'm going to say, hysterical passage from this. Then they're talking about the new treaty between the Czechoslovak government and the Soviet Union that legalized the Warsaw Pact occupation of Czechoslovakia. Reads as follows. The treaty unscrupulously tramples on Czechoslovak sovereignty and reduces the country to a virtual vassal of Soviet revisionist social imperialism. Yet in the treaty, the Soviet revisionists shamelessly quibble that they do not violate the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia. The Soviet revisionists have put Czechoslovakia under long-term military occupation, committing all kinds of evil, suppressing the people, and taking a direct part in the domestic affairs of the country. Still in the treaty, they talk nonsense about non-interference in the internal affairs of Czechoslovakia. What difference is there between these gangster acts of the Soviet revisionists and those of Japanese imperialism? While committing barbarous aggression against China, glibly talked about goodwill, cooperation, and prosperity in those days. Well, this is absolute nonsense. Because, I mean, you would think that the Chinese would know better than to compare the Warsaw Pact intervention into Czechoslovakia with the war, the genocidal war waged upon the Chinese people by Japanese imperialism. I mean, this is hysterical nonsense. The Soviet intervention was done with some casualties, but relatively bloodlessly, because the Czech armed forces didn't resist. There were very, very few civilian casualties. The time that the Czechoslovakia was in Comecon, in the Warsaw Pact, or as the West would put it, under Soviet influence, it saw the population increase. It saw the industry rapidly develop. The Czechoslovaks had very highly advanced manufacturing, military manufacturing industries, had a very advanced energy industry that was actually very central to the electricity network that was developed by the Soviet Union across all of the Eastern European territories and the Soviet Union itself. So in terms of education, in terms of industrial development, in terms of agricultural development, in terms of quality of life of the great bulk of the Czech population, in all the period when the Czechoslovakia was in its socialist period, in all that time, those indicators all consistently improved. There were no massacres of the Czech population in the horrible way that the Japanese carried out their massacres and of the Chinese, and the Germans carried out their massacres of the Czechs in the Second World War. So in all of these categories, in terms of the development of Czech industry, in terms of the development of the education system, in terms of the improvement in the material conditions of the Czech population, the Czech working class and peasant population, it absolutely does not qualify as imperialism. Imperialism extracts and asset strips relentlessly. We know this from just examine the imperialist countries, examine the record of the British, examine the record of the French, examine the record of the Germans, of the Americans. It relentlessly extracts wealth. It destroys industries. Examine the record of the Germans since the fall of the people's democracies in 1989 to 91. Examine what has happened to Czechoslovakia, well, now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but especially the Czech Republic after 1991. Deindustrialization, depopulation, collapse of domestic industry, replacement of domestically produced products with imports from Germany, France, America, etc. To accuse the Soviet Union of being an imperialist power, it is to render the term imperialism as having no meaning whatsoever, because under every single comparison that you could make with the actions of actual imperialist powers, it just does not qualify. Life in Czechoslovakia continued to improve for the vast majority of the population, even until right near the end with the collapse of the system. So this is a nonsense. To compare it to the Japanese occupation of China, I'm amazed a Chinese person could write that, to be completely honest. It's a insane proposition. And unfortunately, the same is true for the Albanian analysis, which took its lead from the Communist Party of China. And I'll come back to the mistakes that this analysis led to later on. But what the Enver Hoxha suggested through articles in the major Albanian newspaper Zere I Populit, and published in pamphlet form, they made very much the same analysis. Accused the Soviet leaders of social imperialism, and they called for an armed resistance against the Soviet armed forces and against the Warsaw Pact forces. And I'll just put the link to this in the chat so you can all see it and check this out at your leisure. So this article from Zere Populite was published in just after the Warsaw Pact intervention in 1968. And what I believe Hoxha probably wrote this, or at least dictated it. And what they called for was the formation of a new party, a Marxist-Leninist party that would resist both the Soviet Union and the influence of the West German imperialists. Now, again, this is a nonsense claim, a nonsense analysis, which in effect resembles the Trotskyite analysis. It resembles what the Trotskyites used to call for, which is to use the old slogan of the old International Socialist Group, now the SWP in Britain, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. In other words, neither the one thing that exists nor the other thing that exists, but something that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as international socialism. Is something which can only come about in later stages of socialism, when we've moved beyond the traditional definition of the nation state. Every form of socialism is going to be a socialism with national characteristics in the near future. So it again, like that's a nonsense phrase. But what the Albanian analysis basically does the same thing. They say that the Soviet, this is a contending, this is a fight between the Dubček clique which is in favor of the restoration of capitalism, the Brezhnev clique in Moscow, which is also in favor of the restoration of capitalism, and the imperialists, who also want the restoration of capitalism, and that the true communists need to resist all of these, which is utopian ultra-left garbage, to be blunt about it. The fact is that although, and I will come to this when we talk about Fidel Castro and the Cuban communist analysis, although it was true that that Novotny, Dubček, etc., the group that came immediately before Dubček, which is headed by Novotny and Dubček himself, were all revisionists. They all advocated, especially Dubček, for pro-capitalist positions. And Dubček was especially very close to the West Germans and actively wanted the restoration of capitalism, as did Ota Sik, who was his finance guy, as we covered last time. But to, again, claim that the thing that communists needed to do then was to form a new party and fight all three at the same time, it is absolute nonsense to equate the West German state at that time with the Soviet Union. The West German state based on a solid foundation of American money and fascist military and intelligence personnel. To equate that with the Soviet Union is a joke. And that's essentially what Enver Hoxha and the Albanian party became. They became a joke because they took these absolutely nonsensical ultra-left positions. Again, they started from a place where they were making entirely legitimate points about the Khrushchevites, about their treacherous nature. And they certainly were treacherous. And they certainly did derail the progress towards socialism. They certainly did a lot of damage. But they went from making good points about that to just going on an absolute ultra-left binge, which ultimately revealed itself to be a very fragile mode of existence. The Albanian Party of Labour, for all of its strident denunciations of everybody else, lasted no longer than the Titoites did. They lasted no longer than the Khrushchevites themselves did. They collapsed at the same time. So regardless of the heroic role played by Enver Hoxha in the 40s and 50s, the heroic deeds that he and other leaders of the Albanian party carried out in the resistance against the fascist occupation in World War II, they obviously made a lot of the same mistakes as the very people they denounced. And they're clinging to this like ultra-left form of criticism led them ultimately in a rightist direction, which is what always happens. The ultra-leftists become rightists. Why? In the case of Hoxha, it was over the Kosovo question. He ended up backing the reactionary forces in Kosovo that were clearly acting in concert with the CIA and MI6 against the Yugoslav government. Now, the Yugoslav government, of course, by the early 1980s had an absolute ton of problems, was run by Titoite revisionists, all very true. But at the same time, to support, as Hoxha did, the breaking up of Yugoslavia by encouraging the Albanian separatist forces, who were always led by reactionaries in the early 1980s, that's a very, very backward, foolish and reactionary decision in itself, and does the reputation of Hoxha no good whatsoever. Now, I'll now turn to the main subject of discussion of this, which is, of course, the analysis done by Communist Party of Cuba and Fidel Castro. Now, what I want to see here is that this is, in my view, the single best analysis of the situation published, other than those that done by Kim Il-sung and the Koreans, which we talked about last time. But I would encourage everybody to read this, because this was an address given by Fidel Castro to the entire Cuban population on television. Also, I believe it went out on the radio. It did this live. And I think it's an exemplary way of dealing with the issue. because this is quite an extensive, it's a transcript of his remarks, and it runs for at least 80 minutes. And Castro did this live. And this was after an extensive discussion in the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, where they come up with a very specific line on the events of the Warsaw Pact intervention. And I think this is by far the most comprehensive and exemplary fashion that this is dealt with, rivaled only by the analysis of Kim Il-sung. And I think it is a proper dialectical analysis. And it is also exemplary because Castro did this live on television to the entire Cuban population, and he addresses the contradictions in the Soviet position absolutely honestly. And this didn't appear to damage relations with the Soviet Union, by the way, despite the fact that Castro deals with this very certain problems very openly in a way that would not have been comfortable listening for the Soviet leaders at the time. So please be sure to read that. I think it's an absolutely fantastic example of what made Castro and the Cubans so strong at the time, and also what makes them strong to this day, even with the incredibly difficult set of circumstances that they've been dealing with for a long time. The Cuban Revolution survives, even with all of its issues. And I think it's because of the very strong revolutionary traditions within Cuba, and also the insistence stemming from the Castro era that the party and the people be as one, and that this obviously is something which continues under Diaz-Canel. So I'm going to read a series of quotes from this and then talk about them. So it starts off with Castro talking about the fact that there were clearly problems with the Czech government that existed before and during the Dubček period. So here I'll quote from Castro himself. Quote reads as follows: "Then there were the problems in connection with incorrect methods of government, the bureaucratic policy, the alienation of the masses. In short, a number of errors for which they blamed the old leadership. There was also talk about the necessity of giving revolutionary orthodoxy to the development of the socialist revolution and the socialist system in Czechoslovakia." So Castro starts off by acknowledging that in Czechoslovakia, the system under Novotny, the predecessor to Dubček, was overly bureaucratic. There were problems in terms of the connection between the party and the state and the masses. There were bureaucratic distortions, and that this had led to an alienation between the masses and the party and the state. And this is precisely why Dubček was able to get attain the political impact that he did, because these problems did exist. He was exploiting a situation, certainly Dubček and Otasik and others, but it was a situation that had come about because of failures of the pre-existing system. So he then goes on to talk about the aims of the imperialists. And I'll read another quote from Castro here. "The imperialists are waging this campaign not only in Czechoslovakia, but in all Eastern European nations, including the Soviet Union. They try by every means to mount publicity campaigns in favor of the way of life in the developed industrial societies and in favor of the tastes and the consumer goods of the developed bourgeois societies. They do this on the radio and through what they call cultural exchange programs. They very subtly try to awaken in the masses admiration and an appetite for such tastes, for such consumer habits." And we all know that that is exactly, of course, what they were doing all the way across every socialist country in terms of propaganda, trying to portray the nations in the West as having this great standard of living, that the Soviets were standing in the way of the working class in the East and Central European countries from getting, and all they need to do is to shed the socialism, and they will be able to live like the West did. It's because this, of course, was all a lie, because even people in the West didn't live like they said we did in the propaganda. Now, Castro goes on to talk about the problems that lay within the Czechoslovak system. Again, he's talking about both before and during the Dubček period. So he goes on to say, if in later stages it were necessary for our revolutionary people to go deeply into these concepts of what is meant by the communist society, it would be found that the ideal of the communist society cannot be the ideal of the industrialized bourgeois society. It can in no way be the ideal of the society of capitalist bourgeois consumption. So what he's talking about there is the problems that existed in countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland and Yugoslavia and Hungary in particular, which is that they took, rather than trying to develop an actual social, what I would call a proper proletarian consciousness, and to develop a consciousness within the workers and peasants that could push towards socialism, which would, of course, include mobilizing the masses to further the revolution, consistently politicizing the working class and things like that. What the Czech government did was the same thing that the Poles did, which was try and legitimize socialism by essentially securing greater economic growth and a greater availability of consumer goods, whilst at the same time running things in a deeply bureaucratic fashion. This is a recipe that's guaranteed to cause problems, because the Czechs, as with the Poles later, were making promises about economic growth and availability of consumer goods that at that stage they weren't able to deliver on, leading to alienation of the masses. At the same time, the role of the masses in the governance of the system was being downscaled. It was being downscaled before Dubček came along. So that's a perfect recipe for mass alienation from the system, claiming that you push the working class out of direct management in the system, or you minimize it, you try and depoliticize the working class, and you base the legitimacy of the socialist system on its ability to deliver consumer goods to the population. And again, these were disastrous decisions that were taken. And it ultimately ended up with mass revolts in Poland, not just in the period of Solidarność, but much earlier, sorry. So he goes on, Castro does, to talk about the experience that Cubans had with Czechoslovakia, again, before Dubček and during. So he talks about the reports that come back from Cubans who go there. So this reads as follows. Cuban visitors and scholarship students have been many times and returned saturated with dissatisfaction and disgust, and have said the youth there are not being educated in the ideals of communism. The youth there are not educated in the principles of internationalism. The youth there are highly influenced by all the ideas and by all tastes of the Western European countries. In many places there, they speak only about money. In many places, they all talk about incentives, about material incentives of all sorts, about profits and wages. And really, an internationalist, a communist awareness is not being developed. Quote continues. Some have told us with astonishment, well, volunteer work does not exist. People are paid for performing volunteer work. Payment for volunteer work is in existence. It is almost a heresy from the Marxist viewpoint on simple volunteer work. All sorts of practices are followed, including if a plane makes a good landing or another plane does not land well, if a man makes a good or a bad parachute jump, there goes an incentive or something else. Many of our people, many of our men, have more than once suffered trauma because of this vulgarization of material incentives, of that making of men's awareness vulgarly materialistic. And this, of course, is very true in terms of what was going on in Czechoslovakia. They had ceased, as Castro says, to try and educate the younger generations in Marxism-Leninism. They had ceased to try and politicize the younger generations and had, in fact, just trying to buy them off with material progress. And this, of course, was to have the effect of essentially hollowing out the Czech party, so that by the reason why you have just a total collapse in 1989 and the so-called Velvet Revolution is because the party itself had withered away. And the party itself had withered away because they weren't training new generations in revolutionary practice. They were trying to essentially consistently buy off the population with material incentives. Well, capitalism can always offer greater material incentives, as it turns out. And the fact that they got rid of the volunteer work, that the only motivation that they were trying to use for people in the economic sphere was greater and greater bonuses. Well, all this does is create a greater and greater bourgeois consciousness, even amongst the working class. And this is the basis of Dubčekism. It is also the basis of Gorbachevism later on, of course. And also recall what the words that we went through from Kim Il-sung later, and also Kim Jong-il mentions this, is that unless you're constantly reinforcing, if you're a country that's surrounded by capitalist powers, or you're on the border with a country like Western Germany, which has been heavily invested in to be a showcase of capitalism, then you'd better be carrying out your propaganda work and your training of the new generation in the need for bravery, selflessness, and self-sacrifice in terms of fighting for the development of socialism. But because the propaganda of the capitalist is very well developed and very much targeted at the youth, and they'd stopped actually agitating amongst the youth almost entirely. So a whole generation then grows up from the late 60s to the late 80s with only a knowledge of shall we say, bourgeois-style incentives. No wonder the system got hollowed out by the late 80s. Now, the Castro then goes on to talk about the dangers of what he calls, what he refers to as the Dubček's peace program. And this is, again, every criticism he's making of the Czech leadership could also be applied to the Soviet leadership at certain points, certainly under Khrushchev in his early period, and also in the middle period of the Brezhnev era, because he's talking about the talk of peace, but the talk of is that Dubček was coming out with ending the Cold War, and again, certainly was also applied in the Gorbachev era. This talk of peace becomes a peace without principle, and becomes peace at any price. So Castro says the following: the dangers posed to the world by the existence and aggressiveness of imperialism are unquestionable. The threat hanging over the world because of the tremendous contradiction existing between the fact of a great part of the world being dominated by imperialism and people's desire and need to liberate themselves from the imperialist yoke is unquestionable. Those who are incendiaries of war are the imperialists. The imperialists are the adventurers. Because this was a line that the revisionists used to use against the Chinese and against others, was that, oh, those who push for revolution, they just want war. They're encouraging war with the imperialists. They're dangerous people. But Castro makes the right point, which is no, the imperialists themselves have no choice but to be endlessly aggressive towards the socialist countries. And the only way to finally resolve that is by, first of all, freeing oppressed nations from the domination of colonialism and neocolonialism. Now, if you could do that peacefully, that would be great. But of course you can't, because the imperialists are going to resist with all the arms they have at their disposal. So they are the constant promoters of war. But if you are a communist, if you're fighting for liberation, then you had better be prepared for when the imperialists bring you that war. And if you're going to talk constantly of peace and the possibilities of peace without actually making it clear where the aggression comes from and why the aggression is inevitable and will continue, and whatever peace can be found with the imperialists will only be temporary and will always be broken by them, then again, you are essentially disarming your population. You are lying to them and lulling them into a false sense of security, that peace can be attained just by making concessions. This was the early Khrushchev period. He swung away from it later on when there was more of a revolt against him. This was certain aspects of the Brezhnev period, but it was certainly true. This came to a horrible fruition in the Gorbachev period, where it was literally became peace at any price. But the precedent had already been set from the Khrushchev period, where not only did they try to make some sort of shady deal with the imperialists that didn't work, but also that they encouraged amongst all the communist parties the idea that there could be peaceful transitions to socialism, or that there was no need to transition to socialism at all, or that the communist party should actively oppose revolutionary situations when they arose. This is all the bitter fruit of the Khrushchevite tree, which pushed for literally peace at any price, even the price being capitulation and defeat. And I'll read a couple more quotes here because I think this is very crucial for our understanding. Castro goes on to say the following: "These threats are realities, and these realities are not erased simply by preaching in our own homes by an excessive desire for peace. In any event, they can preach peace in the enemy camp, but never in their own camp, because this will only bring about the disappearance of combat spirit, a weakening of the people's readiness to face risk, sacrifices, and all the consequences that the international reality entails. That international reality imposes all sorts of sacrifices, not only the danger of sacrificing our blood, but also sacrifices of material nature. When the peoples know that the realities of the world, the independence of the country, and their internationalist duties demand making investments and sacrifices to strengthen the country's defenses, the masses will be much better prepared to work enthusiastically in this direction, to make sacrifices and to understand this need, being aware of the dangers caused by the unwillingness to make these sacrifices when their minds have been influenced and softened by an incessant, senseless, and unexplainable campaign for peace. That is a very strange way to defend peace. It was for that reason that at the outset we committed so many blunders." He's talking about in the early period of the Cuban Revolution. "Either through ignorance or ingenuousness. It has been a long time since we have painted signs saying, 'Long live peace,' 'Long live this or that.' At the beginning, either to mimic or to imitate everything that came here was repeated until the time came when we said, 'What sense does the sign, 'Long live peace,' make? Let us place this sign in New York. Long live peace in New York. Long live peace in Washington. Let us preach peace there in the midst of the only ones responsible for the fact that peace is not secure, in the midst of the only ones who are really bellicose, in the midst of the only ones responsible for war, the only ones among whom the preaching of peace could at least help to weaken the tremendous taxes imposed upon the people to finance adventuresome, aggressive, colonizing, imperialist, and exploiting war, and not here in our camp.'" So that is, I think, a brilliant exposition of the terrible and rotten nature of the revisionist Soviet leadership's push for peace at any price, and the constant agitation within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries that peace was possible, and that peace with the imperialists could come with the right negotiation. And this was something that should be striven towards, and we shouldn't threaten them too much. Now, this, of course, was something that the imperialists would never repay in kind. They will say, "Oh, thank you very much for your weakness. We will now exploit it." The point that Castro is making now is that you have to be honest, as he is doing here, with the population of your country, which is that if Czechoslovakia or Poland or Bulgaria or Yugoslavia is to retain independence, it will be in the teeth of endless aggression from the imperialists, even if they talk of friendship, even if they talk of peace, as they did to all these countries from time to time. But if you don't recognize that the nature of imperialism is to be relentlessly hostile and will always be hostile, then you have essentially disarmed your own population, ideologically speaking, which is what all the revisionist countries ended up doing, which is why they collapsed without a fight. And the origin of this, the root of all this, is twofold. There's two, should we say, origins of the roots of these things. One is in the disastrous idea advanced by Khrushchev that class conflict disappears under the rule of the Communist Party, and that there's no need for the dictatorship of the proletariat anymore. A disastrous idea when Khrushchev said it. A potentially disastrous idea now that the Chinese leadership still insist on saying this, and that the Vietnamese leadership still insist on saying this. It was a terrible idea when it was done 60 years ago. It remains a terrible idea now. Now you can have your issues with how the Cultural Revolution proceeded. I think there was a lot of mistakes made there, but certainly it was a necessary corrective to those
like Liu Shaoqi, like Deng Xiaoping, who sought to deny that there was still a class conflict going on in China, or those like the Soviet revisionists who denied that there was a class conflict going on inside the USSR, and not just against the residual leftovers from Tsardom and Russian capitalism, but from capitalist tendencies which constantly emerge and re-emerge in the Soviet Union. And by not being honest about that, and by not empowering the working class to act against that, you open the door for capitalist restoration, which is what the Soviet Union did. And also, stemming from that is this deluded belief that a deal can be struck with the imperialists, because they want the pro-capitalist clique in the Soviet Union wanted domestic peace so that they could go on and develop essentially a full restoration of capitalism, and do so in cooperation with the imperialists. That's what they wanted. It's what the Gorbachev clique was desperate for. It's what the Yeltsin clique was desperate for. They never got it, because the imperialists don't want partnership with either the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation. But this is the key point, and this is the point that Castro is making. By insisting on peace, stemming from, of course, their desire to do away with or gloss over or suppress internal contradictions, the Czech leadership, and beyond them the Soviet leadership, disempowered the domestic working class. Now, he goes on then to talk about the Warsaw Pact intervention itself, and why, in the belief of the Cuban Communist Party leadership, this was something that was justified. And this is, I'll read again from the document. The essential thing, says Castro, whether we accept it or not, is whether the socialist bloc could permit the development of a political situation which led to the breakdown of a socialist country and its fall into the arms of imperialism. From our viewpoint, it is not permissible, and the socialist bloc has the right to prevent it in one way or another. Quote continues. We all know that the leadership in Czechoslovakia generally had for 20 years was a leadership that was saturated with many vices of dogmatism and bureaucracy, and in some, many things which cannot be considered a model of truly revolutionary leadership. We here present our views on the pseudo-liberal nature of this group, which has been praised so much by imperialism. It does not at all mean that we are expressing our support for the former leadership. We must keep in mind that leadership with which we maintained relations from the beginning sold us many arms that were war booty captured from the Nazis, and we have been paying and are still paying for weapons that belonged to the Hitlerite troops that occupied Czechoslovakia. Naturally, I'm not referring to the weapons which a country has to manufacture as an industrial and commercial product, especially if it is a country with a limited economy. We do not pretend to say, give away the arms you manufacture in your industry as part of the social production and trade exchange to a country with relatively few resources. But they sold us many weapons that belonged to the Nazi armies, and we have to pay for them, and we are still paying for them. That is a reality. And we must learn to analyze these realities, and to learn when one interest must give way to another. Interest, in order that romantic and idealistic positions do not accord with these realities, may be avoided. We must, against all those bourgeois liberal reforms within Czechoslovakia, but we are also against the liberal economic reforms that are taking place in the other socialist camp countries. Of course, we have the criterion that we should not tell them how they should realize the building of socialism, but in the face of occurrences, we must make this analysis. So there's a couple of things in this extensive quote there. One, Castro is quite clear that if you allow Czechoslovakia to turn back to the imperialist camp, it'll have a knock-on effect of encouraging counter-revolution in all the socialist countries, and that was absolutely true. Secondly, he's talking about the actions of the Czech leadership prior to Dubček, which in the late 50s, when the Cubans were trying to buy weaponry to re-equip their armed forces, they found that the communist bloc, the socialist bloc, the people's democracies, were very unwilling to make deals with them under the leadership of course, of the Khrushchevites. they were very unwilling to actually sell the Cubans weapons. Come to the disgraceful role of Tito in just a moment. But what he's talking about here is that the Czechs would only sell them stockpiles of weaponry that had been left behind by the Nazis, which was German weaponry from 14 years prior, sometimes longer. And so it was out-of-date old German weaponry that they sold to the Cubans at way over the odds, price-wise. So it's hardly an act of international solidarity by the Czech leadership. And again, that's the Czech leadership that existed before Dubček. So what Castro is saying is, well, we're not actually defending the actions of the pre-existing Czech leadership because we had our issues with that. But what was being done was an attempt to fully restore capitalism, and that must be opposed, even if we have issues with what the Czech leadership has done in the past. So just to go on to the disgraceful role of Tito in this, the Titoites were actively selling arms to the Batista government right up until the end, right up until just before the fall of Havana and the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. The Castro quotes at one point in the document, in his address to the Cuban people, that the Yugoslav embassy in Mexico was negotiating a major arms deal with the Batista government in 1959, just before their triumph. But when immediately after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, when the Cuban government, headed by Fidel Castro, tried to negotiate a deal with the Yugoslavs, they were fucked around. They were told that they could only supply a limited amount of arms to them, that they could only supply it through a shell company, and this and that and the other. And it was nothing like the extensive arms package they were prepared to offer the Batista government. And they were going to charge them more for it. And that's the Titoites. Why? Because the Titoites were always looking to make nice with imperialism. Didn't do them any good. Imperialism turned on them in the end. And they didn't want to damage their relationship with US imperialism by coming out and selling arms at a discounted rate or something to a supposedly fellow socialist government. And Castro goes on to point out that Yugoslavia plays a damaging role within the socialist world because, in essence, it is representing the interests of imperialism. How else to explain the fact that they would sell arms to Batista and not sell arms except at an exorbitant price and in a convoluted mechanism to the new revolutionary Cuban government? He goes on to talk about the fact that the Czech government was trying to, in essence, restore capitalism, and that this was something that was being actively encouraged by US imperialism, that they were preparing loans from the International Monetary Fund to go to the new Czech government, that the West Germans were having very heavy concessions made to them. We talked about that last week. But I would encourage everybody to go and read that article or that speech by Castro. It's an excellent way of to analyze what was a very interesting and complex situation, and that this is Castro provides a real model of how to deal with that in terms of analysis, but also how to be honest and open with the Cuban people about what was going on. And of course, not he doesn't do it, come out and say, "Oh, that Brezhnev's a twat," but he does criticize the Soviet revisionists quite extensively in that document. He focuses most of his criticism on the Czechs and the Yugoslavs, but if you know what you're talking about, if you know your history, you can see that he's directly criticizing the actual policies of the Soviet leadership at the time. So that's a really interesting example of how to deal with a controversial issue in a direct way, and in a way that even criticizes your biggest ally. And Castro got away with that. They remained close to the Soviet Union until the Gorbachev years, even during the Gorbachev years, in actual fact. So I'm going to just take a quick pause now and go for some questions. So if you have your questions, just shove them in the chat. We'll take them. And first of all, we will greet everybody who is with us so far. So hello to Anthony, hello to Victor, hello to Alistair from Prague, hello to Albert, Ogas Cybernetics, Pat Spackman from Bristol, Jerry Crod, Lars Tom One. The music and the introduction I think you're referring to is it Lenin is Young Again, Soviet song from the 1970s. Hello to Anthony McKeown. Hello to Mushkin, Barney Boomer, Bertram from Swindon, James Graham, Nemo Yederman, Chandler, who says the People's Republic of China supporting the Khmer Rouge over the Vietnamese revolutionaries reveals a lot about the terrible foreign policy in this era, and that is 100% correct. We also got Sid Hatfield, we got Richard from Las Vegas, we have Jenny, our moderator, thanks to you. We have Edward here who gives us a quote from Zuganov, who says, "This was a betrayal. The party bureaucracy gave the victory to the capitalists without a fight in the face of the surrender of the leadership of the mass. Face of the surrender of the leadership, the masses were demoralized and disoriented." Yes, and the KPRF analysis of the Gorbachev years is usually actually quite strong, and I would encourage everybody to read it. X says, "Is Telegram safe?" It's a pretty safe app to use. Only it's about as safe as anything else, on the grounds that if you're looking to protect your personal information, well, unfortunately, the state's got it all anyway. So if you want to use Telegram, go right ahead. Hello to Holger Ritter in Sweden. DFX says a dark money group is funding high-profile democratic influencers. Well, I am shocked. Dixon Balzac says, question, because nowadays the Slovak people are quite socially conservative. Well, some of them are. That's putting it mildly. They're very religious, protective of their culture, hostile towards foreigners. Is social conservatism compatible with communism? Well, let's separate this out. Communism refers to a higher stage of development that's only reached after an extensive period of the rule of the dictatorship of the proletariat and a period of building socialism. So communism is way off in the distance. It's an aim we want to get towards. We call ourselves communists because that's the society that we want to get to. Now, I think what you're referring to, though, is would that be compatible with shall we say, a move towards socialism? And I would say absolutely yes. The Slovaks were the source of resistance against Dubček and a source of resistance against capitalist restoration in the 90s. And there's nothing particularly wrong with wanting to protect your industry, your country, to being opposed to the EU, being opposed to the supposedly progressive forces that the EU embodies, and being protective of national cultures, etc. There's nothing wrong with that. So I wouldn't say it's a negative thing. It's entirely compatible with wanting to restore some kind of socialism to Slovakia. Entirely compatible. Slovakia is a nation that's been completely done over by the restoration of capitalism, as has the Czech Republic. But the Slovak people have done very badly out of the whole deal. So I'd say that those who are hostile to the EU and hostile to NATO, that's the base of people out of whom a movement back to socialism could be built. Alistair says, grinds my gears hearing Czechs say they swapped German occupation for Soviet occupation like they were the same. It was it's a completely nonsense claim. Like, to compare like the criminality of the Nazis who looted Czechoslovakia with the Soviets who built it back up again is historical gibberish. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction that's been promoted by the powerful forces who took over Czechoslovakia following the implosion of revisionism. So not a surprise that it's caught on, because it's been repeated endlessly.
Hello to Comrade Terry. Going through the comments here. Mr. Jolaf22 says, I read the Castro thing a while ago and thought it hit the nail on the head. Indeed, it did. I often find Castro's opinions very unbiased and really open. Well, truly was a great leader, but we should also emphasize that this was the considered position of the Cuban Communist Party Central Committee. So this was something that had been discussed extensively at the highest level in the Cuban party. Castro was expressing that. So we should always say that Castro, though a great leader, was a great leader who had a very solid, a very highly politically developed central committee and party backing him up. Question asked Nehat. Here there is a nostalgia for the USSR in Russian society. Is there anything like that in the Czech Republic today? Don't know. I think that there is a certain degree of it, but I haven't done enough research to know amongst whom. Hello to Svetlana from Prague. Be sure to like and share the stream, everybody, if you haven't done so already. So just checking in here. Okay. So yes, let's get on with some more questions. Sid says it's remarkable how the same propaganda still carries a great deal of weight in other overexploited countries, like i.e. South America and the Philippines, where people think the streets are paved with gold in the USA. Streets in the USA in most areas seem to be paved with homeless people and junkies. Problem we're going to be having here to a greater degree very soon. Good evening to Comrade Davey. And as Chandler says, nostalgia for the socialist era is much stronger in Slovakia than in the Czech Republic. Hello to Carter Mann. Sid Hatfield says, the one that Chris Hedges romanticizes, the Velvet Revolution. Yes. Well, read the book, The Velvet Counter-Revolution. That's a much better way of looking at things. Doubt Chris Hedges has read that one, though. So be sure to add your question into the chat. Yes, the Velvet Counter-Revolution, book by the great Belgian communist Ludo Martens. So look that one up if you need a guide to the counter-revolutionary period. As D. Quay says, don't you know that Cuba is an authoritarian dictatorship? Yes, and that's why we like it. But seriously, of course, I think our friend there is making a joke. Cuba is a far more democratic place than any country in the imperialist world. Any country in the imperialist world. Like, they had a constitutional revision process a few years ago, so there was the opportunity for mass participation in redrawing the Cuban constitution. They often do these like huge consultation exercises. The masses have a role in the governance of the state that is far more advanced than anything in any of the so-called capitalist democracies. It is, of course, the usual nonsense from the imperialists. Grassy Knoll says, I read a book about Sam Giancana, head of the Chicago mob. The CIA had hired him to assassinate Castro. So when the FBI greeted him at an airport, he said to the agent, why are you following me? Yes. Pavel Linovsky says, the Marxist-Leninist education and class consciousness in Poland was crap. In the health sectors, doctors got bribed regularly to treat their patients. It was socially normal. Yeah. So the collapse, when it came, was a collapse that had been coming a long time, because they had stopped being Marxist. They had stopped being communists. They had essentially restored capitalist norms almost fully before the end. And they had diluted and watered down class consciousness to the point where a con man like Lech Walesa could get a following. Mr. Jolaf says, it is always important what Lenin meant with the peaceful coexistence, not cooperation, but isolation without war, as the capitalists will cause their own war on their own. That's true. This was the complete misusing of Lenin's comments on peaceful coexistence, meaning that all that meant was, we won't start a war with you. That's all it meant.
It was like, we will not seek out confrontation with you. We will not carry out acts of military aggression against you, but we will defend ourselves if you do that against us. That was completely warped by the Khrushchevites into, we want peace and we want to cooperate with you. Well, how do you cooperate with imperialism? You still see this shite, by the way, from the Chinese, rhetorically at least, keep saying we need a world based on win-win cooperation. Well, that's not what imperialism is after. Imperialism only ever had vaguely positive relations with the Chinese when the Chinese essentially agreed to be the workshop of the United States, building masses of cheap commodities for sale to the working class in the United States, so it would alleviate the decline in working class wages and make a lot of profit at the same time. You don't get to cooperate with imperialism. Imperialism doesn't want to cooperate with you. They want to suppress and subordinate you. And if you lie to the masses about that, you're only digging your own grave and theirs. Let's just scroll through the comments here. Sid says, peace cannot be had under their system. Hello to Nicole, who's tuning in late. Hello to James Goblin in the Once and Future Socialist Yugoslavia. Right, what else we got here? Okay. Edward says, in Soviet Latvia, the relatively high support for the counter-revolution came from the fact that the industrial development, the high industrial development, because consumerism and consumer industries and bourgeois management. Yeah, it's not just a question of material development. This is the crucial thing you have to understand about the development of socialism. It is not just a question of, we're going to develop better and faster than the capitalists, even though that can happen. It's also a question of what kind of development. What kind of development do you have? What kind of economy are we developing? Why is it that under socialism, we will not be seeking to develop the same kind of consumerist outlook as capitalism does? First of all, because consumerism creates a lot of needless waste, waste of resources, particularly, but also it instills the wrong values in people. It creates isolation and an isolationist mentality. It only furthers alienation. This isn't to say that we want the working class to not have a decent life, not have decent housing, not have be able to buy decent clothing, etc. That's not what it's about. What consumerism refers to is the elevation of the act of fucking shopping and purchasing commodities into something which is meant to bring you a sense of deep personal satisfaction, and is meant to be something which you regard as a healthy leisure activity rather than just a necessity. It's been elevated up to that level of almost like religious-like practice, particularly when shopping used to be more of an event where you used to have to go to a shopping mall or something. But it's been elevated into this whole lifestyle under late-stage capitalism, because you need to essentially keep the proletariat constantly distracted with new shiny objects. Under socialism, all of the consumer goods that are going to be built would be more durable, would have a much longer lifespan, and there would be fewer of them. Like, you don't need 70 varieties of toothpaste, for fuck's sake. We need effective products which do the job they're designed to do, which are actually durable and can actually serve the purpose for which they're designed, which a lot of capitalist commodities don't do what they say on the tin. They break very quickly. They're designed to become obsolete very quickly. So trying to replicate capitalist consumer culture in a supposedly socialist system is another terrible mistake in the end. It will create and recreate a series of like wildly individualistic values that do not serve the best interests of the working class ultimately, and will only undermine the socialist system. So interesting point from Edward, who says that this is the reason why the Latvian counter-revolution developed, was because there was a industrial development lent towards consumer good production and consumer industries and very heavy bourgeois management. And that's why Latvia became a source of counter-revolution, not just petty nationalism. That's very interesting perspective there. If you have any suggestions on reading for that, I'd like to learn more about how the economic base of the Baltic states furthered counter-revolution there. Edward asks, was Czechoslovakia broken up in 1993 by imperialism to divide and conquer, or by inner reactionaries? Was the breaking up a progressive or regressive move? I would argue it was the internal reactionaries acting on the strong advice of like the US and the Germans, I would say. With the idea being that, much like Yugoslavia, like even if Yugoslavia had converted wholly to capitalism, they would have wanted to break it up because they don't want partnership with you. It's much easier to dominate a Czech Republic and a Slovakia that are separated than it would have been a unified Czechoslovakia. And that's why they promote petty nationalism in former Soviet states, former socialist states. Divide and rule becomes more effective. Mr. Kostadinov says, China is the second biggest trading partner of Israel, and before the live stream Holocaust, they were selling surveillance tech for the West Bank occupation. Yeah. And that's a complete disgrace and reveals much about the problems that exist within the Chinese system, which is that the Chinese system has within it bourgeois tendencies that want to collaborate with US imperialism, have made money collaborating with US imperialism. Again, we defend China against the plots of US imperialism, but it's pointless lying, as many revisionists do, about the criminality of the Dengists. The Dengists in the 80s backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They opened up relations with the apartheid state of South Africa and backed Jonas Savimbi in Angola. That's not exactly a good track record, is it? And they also have extensive relations with the state of Israel, as, by the way, does the Russian government. Pointless pretending otherwise. And it's also pointless pretending that the Chinese practice some form of revolutionary internationalism. They don't. They do business with anybody, including Israel. So let's just be honest here about what Dengism leads to. It's led to a whole series of contradictions inside China itself, which stem from the usual revisionist denial of the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Chinese leadership to this day still, I would say, hysterically denies that there are glaring class contradictions in China. Go through the entire works of Xi Jinping. I have. The only mention that he makes of these things is to make it clear that they have no intention of going anywhere near the legacy of the Cultural Revolution, and that's the bad bit of Mao that they don't uphold. And again, the revisionists, even though they've been a much better or more successful set of revisionists than the Soviet leaders were in terms of running an economy with strong market elements. But they've got a lot of problems that stem from having a capitalist class, and also having same thing that Castro and Kim Il-sung referred to, which is you have a lot of the Chinese youth in particular that have been brought up to be worshippers of commodities and consumerism. And before any Dengists out there start, getting their fucking their pants in a twist about their sacred hero, this is not an argument for poverty. This is something that the revisionists always lie about, starting with Deng Xiaoping himself. They always lie about their opponents wanting the proletariat and peasantry to continue living in poverty. That was nonsense. It was nonsense when Deng Xiaoping said it in the 70s against in the 80s against his opponents. It's nonsense now. The only people who make arguments for everybody living in poverty are like primitivists, and they certainly weren't strongly present in like the CPSU or the CPC. And the argument that, oh, you just want the working class to be poor, this is nonsense. What we want is, of course, the development, and I'll use the Chinese expression to talk about this. You want development in a genuine, all-around way, meaning that you want to see the advance of the material conditions of the working class, but you also want to see the educational and the cultural level of the working class be raised so that they can be ready to play their part in the governing of society. Now, the CPSU after a certain point and the CPC after a certain point were and are not invested in that. Yes, the CPC and the Chinese and the PRC have raised the educational and cultural level of the masses to a degree, and the contradictions within China has forced the CPC to restore a certain amount of politicization into the training and education of cadres in the Communist Party. But again, because they deny that there is still there is still a lot of class conflict in China, more so now than there was previously, because of the glaring wealth gaps, because of the fact that you have exploitation of labor, because you have capitalist commodity production. You have all these problems which the CPC leadership still seeks to massage away, and that will lead to more problems later on. The Duran noted that Britain needs a loan from the IMF. Well, we're not there yet. Wouldn't surprise me if that did become the case, though. Now, I will do probably next week. I'll do a special on the IMF loan of 1976 and the comparison with today. But just briefly on this, the IMF loan of 1976 was not as a result of, as the Thatcher defenders will say, of Britain being bankrupt. That wasn't the case. What was the case was that, and I think this is the case now, is that a crisis was, there was like a genuine economic problem in Britain in the 1970s that was resulting of the long-time decline in the profitability of British industry due to the fact that the British capitalist class stopped investing in it and wanted to push in the direction that they've gone in, which is of just relying for their profits more and more on moving capital around the world and less on actually producing commodities for domestic consumption or export. That was the root of the crisis, and there had been stagnant economic growth for years, which the ruling class had been demanding that the successive governments, both Tory and Labour, repair the damage by passing the cost onto the working class in terms of wage freezes, a tax on pensions, cuts in public spending, the usual thing. And they wanted a more full-scale attack against the working class than the government of Harold Wilson was providing. What's the best way that you're going to do that? Well, you need a big, first of all, a big dent being taken to the government's economic credibility. And you need to push the idea that the country is going bankrupt, even though that wasn't true. So what you do is you push the idea that you need an external intervention by the International Monetary Fund, who will provide a loan on the basis that they come in and dictate an economic plan to the British government. Now, the funny thing is, not funny really, but the strange thing is that the way in which the British government acted was as if this was something that the IMF was some sort of neutral body. The IMF was doing this basically on behalf of the British ruling class. The British ruling class are crucial in founding the International Monetary Fund along with the US. Dennis Healey, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1976, Labour Party guy, Labour Party right-winger, though he was a former member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, as a lot of them were back then. He later admitted in his autobiography that he didn't understand what he was being told by the Treasury officials. and that he was being given an inaccurate picture of the actual situation of the British economy, and he was being told by the officials that he had to make a decision, he had to go for the IMF bailout, and if he didn't do that, then the economy might collapse. That's what Healy admitted to later. He later said that he didn't, on reflection, that the IMF bailout, so-called, was a mistake. It was designed basically as a political weapon to justify further attacks on the working class and to set up the coming of Margaret Thatcher and the Tories back into office again. Now, this might be designed around slightly different grounds. Now, some say, like those Duran guys, that part of the scheme is to get Britain back in the EU. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I haven't seen enough evidence that it is. Now, there are those in the British ruling class who do have an agenda to push Britain completely back into the EU. They've never accepted Brexit. They've never accepted that they lost that, and they would do anything to get Britain back in, particularly with increasing British economic problems. I don't see how rejoining the EU makes those economic problems any better, but then again, these people aren't known for their rationality. But it is certainly possible that that is part of the game. Another part of the game could be that some in the British ruling class have decided that they want a full-scale assault on public sector spending, and what they see this as one way of getting it. Bear in mind that I'm going to do some more research into who actually owns British debt. A lot of British debt will be owned by members of and institutions owned by the British ruling class, as is often the case with the debts of any country. Some of the biggest holders of the debt are the ruling class themselves, who are essentially then willing to plunge the rest of the country into bankruptcy as long as their the debts that they own keep getting serviced. It's not them that's going to pay the bill for this. But more on this next week. Kiwi Corner 888 says, Maduro is the real modern Latin American revolution leader in South America in this era. Well, he's certainly the one who takes the strongest positions. That's true. I heard several alternative media personnel saying in Britain was on the verge of civil war and economic crash. Is this your reading of the situation? I'm going to be absolutely blunt with you. Anybody who's telling you that is talking total shit. Now, there's a lot of problems in every imperialist country. But to claim that this brink of civil war stuff, that is repeating ruling class propaganda. And again, I'm going to do another video on this maybe tomorrow, because this is like this is something which is talked up by like ultra reactionaries and liberals in the ruling class media sphere for their own cynical purposes of either promoting like the new version of the Tory party, which is Nigel Farage and Reform, or promoting a vote for the so-called progressives, meaning the Labour Party, the Greens, and the Liberals. It's wildly overhyped nonsense. These immigrant hotel protests, which I'll talk about tomorrow, that are going on, there's quite a few of them, but these are relentlessly promoted by the bourgeois press, and they are being staged by very well-funded reactionary groups, often with money directly from the ruling class or money from American interests like UKIP, like Patriotic Alternative. And even so, even with all that promotion, the protests are still relatively small, but they're being promoted by a ruling class that knows it's in economic and political trouble, so needs to promote as many divisive things as possible. The talk of civil war is a hysterical overreaction. That's not where things are right now. If it was that you would notice it, you would feel it in where you went. There's a lot of disillusionment, there's a lot of demoralization, there's a lot of anger. But again, who's the civil war going to be between? The English Civil War was between the fading power of like the old feudal ruling class and the rising power of the capitalist class. Who's this civil war going to be between in Britain? Different tribes of Redditors? Different YouTube channels? This is a fantasy. Now, there may be one in the future, but it would be one between either different factions of the ruling class, that would be one possibility, or a dying ruling capitalist class seeking desperately to cling on against a rising proletariat. This civil war talk is nonsense at the moment. It is just simply not on the cards right now. Duran said that Farage will be the beneficiary of a bailout. He'd be the most immediate beneficiary, yes, because he's the only political figure who has any traction. But again, he's also relentlessly promoted by sections of the ruling class. So, but stay away from those who are talking of civil war, either in the United States or in Britain. Maybe possible at some point in the future, but in the immediate period now, it's a fantasy. It's people trying to sell shit to you, trying to sell entertainment to you. Don't go for this kind of nonsense. Just going through some more comments here. Mr. Jolaf says, sometimes wonder if China is doing a long NEP and this was their only chance to not die like the other socialist countries, and I'm not generally not sure on the whole China issue. Bear in mind, it took a lot to destroy the other socialist countries. They weren't destroyed by external aggression. They were destroyed by internal problems, and those internal problems came from the pro-capitalist element, and it was them that destroyed the Soviet Union. As the Chinese documentaries on the subject, which I've got on the Rumble channel, actually spell out quite well. Now, I think that what it is that the NEP was a coherent program that was designed to be temporary and was designed to restore productivity and to restore an industrial base that had been shattered by the Civil War. China, whilst it was behind the Soviet Union technologically, and certainly behind the United States and the West, China in 1976 was not the same as Russia in 1921. Yeah, it had its problems, but it had developed a long way in terms of its industrial and agricultural productivity. It had nearly doubled life expectancy. It had advanced in every single metric since 1949, and it also had nuclear weapons. So the idea that a beaten and defeated USA, which had just lost in Vietnam, was going to roll into China was nonsense. Now, was there a danger of internal revolt of the pro-capitalist forces? Did that danger exist? Yes, but you know who represented that danger? Deng Xiaoping represented that danger. Now, yes, he didn't do a Gorbachev. Let's just say credit where credit is due. There were others in the Chinese party who did move in a liquidationist Gorbachevite direction, Zhao Ziyang being one of them. And these were Deng Xiaoping's allies in the 1980s. Now, fortunately, the Chinese party still retained all through this period a strong revolutionary wing, and at least a wing, even if they were revisionists, who didn't want to see the rule of the party destroyed. And so they were able to stand up to this counter-revolution in 1989. But the forces that create those counter-revolutionary situations are still there, which is why Xi Jinping talks about handling the contradictions correctly. But, you know, you can try and massage this away all you like, but fundamentally, you've still got a situation where there is a capitalist class in China which still wants to expand its power. How could it not? And that's going to cause more problems. Edward says, what can push the CPC in the direction of open class struggle and an actual move towards socialism, not this constant balancing act that can only lead to catastrophe? Two things. One, in my view, the defeat of the final defeat of the NATO bloc in Ukraine, that might have some influence there. It already has to a degree. Two, other revolutions in other parts of the world. And three, the activities of the domestic working class in China itself. There was increased class struggle after 2008, and that produced a new balance of forces in the CPC represented by the Xi Jinping leadership. So that's something that must be emphasized. So there's a variety of internal and external influences will need to be had to change the trajectory inside the CPC. Predominantly, though, I would say internal, but internal can be influenced by external factors. Well, I think to answer Edward's question about the documentaries, the CPC, I mean, I'm still trying to catch myself up with the versions of Marxism they teach inside China. Like those documentaries were very good, but what it showed was very much a Xi era documentary, meaning that the Xi leadership is of the belief that it can contain the contradictions created by capitalist commodity production in China and the presence of a capitalist class by having a well-motivated, disciplined, and unified party that is able to exercise control over these various different capitalist entities, and by having capitalists like constrained via the party and state machinery. That's the Xi Jinping point of view, and he expresses it repeatedly in his collected works, which I would encourage everybody to read. But can you constrain the Chinese capitalist class using purely administrative methods? And can you constrain them and stop the corrosion of the party, even if you're constantly purging the party, which the Chinese are now, even if you're constantly purging the state hierarchy of corrupt elements, which they are, even if you have the most honest and dedicated communists in the world, if their training doesn't include the fact that class conflict is inevitable and will continue to be inevitable, if that's not included in their training as to how to handle contradictions, then that's going to create problems, because you're creating a bunch of very sincere, honest, and dedicated people whose training isn't apparently completed in the correct fashion. If the leadership's going to carry on denying that these contradictions are glaring and will produce more class struggle, to think that you can manage these with administrative methods, I think, is incorrect. Again, like, this isn't a question of saying that we're taking like the Maoist approach on China or the Trotskyite approach. No, we support the achievements of the Chinese Revolution. We support the Chinese against the attempts by U.S. imperialism to destroy and divide the country, just as we support the actions of the Russian government to defend its territory, sovereignty, and independence against the actions of the US imperialists in Ukraine. But just because we defend something doesn't mean we should blind ourselves as to the nature of the problems that it has. That's why so many people were completely blown apart ideologically by the fall of the Soviet Union, because many people had just been closing their eyes to the glaring problems that did exist there for years. So take our inspiration from the text we've just read through from Castro, which is, you can be an ally of the Chinese, you can be an ally, we can be allies of the Russians, but that doesn't mean that we become salesmen for them. It doesn't mean that we go around and just ignore or try and get everybody to ignore the contradictions that do exist in their systems, because those contradictions are there and are going to be, and the imperialists are working very hard to exploit them. Yes, to answer the questions in the chat, the Katyn massacre was a real thing, and the Nazis did it. The Nazis did it and then tried to use it to divide the alliance between Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. And they dug up the bodies when they were on the retreat and when they needed something to try and cause a division between the Western Allies and the USSR. So it was a very cynical manipulation of a crime that they committed. Yes, and Gorbachev admitted to this because it was demanded of him by the US and the British and the reactionary Poles. Just as he admitted to a series of crimes that the Soviet Union didn't in fact commit in order to appease the West. And just as Putin and Medvedev used to do that as well. Okay, so right, I'm going to bring things to a close for this evening. Join me again tomorrow for a British special, I think, where I'm going to look at the IMF, the supposed IMF bailout, and the immigration protests. So, British special coming up tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And this show would, of course, not be possible without your support. And we will be back with you again later this week with another Decline and Fall program. So be sure to join me for that one. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Now, here's your musical outroduction.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.